Welcome, everyone. It sounds like a how are we doing? Rather grim topic, but far from it. The more you penetrate this realm, at least in Quaker tradition, that could be today with liberal Quakers in England discussing euthanasia or assisted dying, or it could be the early Friends of the Delaware Valley. Do you find there are some surprisingly optimistic and cheerful things that come out of this discussion of death, this usually unpleasant subject? Delaware Deathways, the Quaker idea of optimistic fatalism. By the standards of the age, rates of mortality in the Delaware Valley were in a middling range during the late 17th and early 18th century, lower than in Virginia, but higher than in Massachusetts. From 1675 to 1750, death rates increased and also became increasingly unstable, with sudden surges caused by the spread of epidemic disease. In that setting, the Quakers, no less than Puritans and Anglicans, frequently reminded themselves of what John Woolman called the uncertainty of temporal things. They cultivated an attitude of fatalism which was nearly universal in this era, thinking of those miserable Calvinists a bit further south. But the substance of their fatalistic thinking was not the same as that of other people. The Quaker attitude might be described as optimistic fatalism. This is the two words I really like here. The Quaker attitude might be described as optimistic fatalism, optimistic in more ways than one. They regarded death as the climax of life, an event not to be feared or abhorred, but welcomed and embraced. Death for a believing Quaker was an act of Christian apotheosis, the distinction of the mortal self. Quakers were deeply interested in deathbed scenes, which had a very different texture from those of Puritan Massachusetts. A favourite book among friends was Piety Promoted, an anthology of Quaker deathbed events, which was published in at least 30 editions during the 18th century. This genre was not unique to Quakers. Puritans and Anglicans also produced many collections of the same sort, but the Quakers had different ways of thinking about mortality. An example was the death of a 28-year-old Quaker named Sybil Matlock Cooper in 1759. Her husband recorded the event. As the end approached, she said, "Give me one drop more of cold water, then let me go, if it be by thy will, or if it be thy will." Father, divers times repeating, come death, come death." The blood now retired from her face, and so it was thought she was expiring, but it returned, and she came to her natural colour, as in a time of health, and opening her eyes to be asked to be raised up. She seemed to admire to find herself still with us. I said, "My dear, it might be the Almighty will please to restore you to us again." She replied, "I have not desired it." Many others not merely accepted death, but welcomed it in this manner. Mary Pennington wrote that since she came to be settled in the truth, she lived free from the sting of death and without the least desire to live. Yet another example was William Dillwyn's description of his wife's death. Quote, "Her sense continued to the last and free from pain. She resigned her breath in a happy frame of mind and humble assurance of eternal rest, which even in that solemn hour her countenance sweetly testified, an innocent smile remaining on it when a corpse." Male Quakers showed the same attitude. Joseph Oxley wrote, "I am now pretty far advanced in years, waiting daily until my change shall come, having no desire to stay longer than is my master's goodwill and pleasure. In this state of resignation, I desire to live, and to live so as to be fit to die." It's a lovely last line. I desire to live, and to live so as to be fit to die. Quakers often dreamed about death, as did New England Puritans and Anglican Virginians, and published their dreams in hundreds of journals. Many of these accounts were elaborate death fantasies in which the writers, after an initial feeling of revulsion, embraced death and glorified it. The classic example was a dream that came to John Woolman as he lay upon his sickbed. Quote, "In a time of sickness, when the pleurisy a little upward of 2 years and a half ago, I was brought so near the gates of death that I forgot my name. Being then desirous to know who I was, I saw a mass of matter of a dull, gloomy colour between the south and the east, and was informed that this mass was human beings in as great misery as they could be and live, and that I was mixed with them, and that henceforth I might not consider self as a distinct or separate being. In this state I remained several hours. I then heard a soft melodious voice, more pure and harmonious than any I had heard with my ears before. I believed it was the voice of an angel who spake to other angels. The words were, 'John Woolman is dead.' I soon remembered that I once was John Woolman, and being assured that I was alive in the body, I greatly wondered what that heavenly voice could mean. I believed beyond doubting that it was the voice of a holy angel, but as yet it was a mystery to me. The song of the angel remained a mystery, and in the morning, my dear wife and some others coming to my bedside, I asked them if they knew who I was, and they telling me I was John Woolman, thought I was only light-headed, for I told them not what the angels said. At length I felt a divine power prepare my mouth that I could speak, and then I said, 'I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ that liveth in me.' Then the mystery was opened, and I perceived there was joy in heaven over a sinner who had repented, and that the language, 'John Woolman is dead,' meant no more than the death of my own will. In the face of death, Quakers cultivated an attitude not merely of resignation but confident expectation. For believing Quakers, death became the fulfillment of life. It was an escape from the corruptions of the world and the final transcendence of the mortal self. When death actually came to a Quaker household, the entire family assembled and shared an experience of the highest solemnity. The last words were heard with loving attention. The dying friend lay at the very centre of his friends and relations. Visitors crowded into the room, and children were also required to watch, listen, and reflect. But once the spirit had flown, so to speak, Quakers showed comparatively little interest in the physical remains of the deceased. Burial, funeral, and mourning customs were exceptionally austere in this culture. Quakers grieved over the deaths of their loved ones as deeply as other people, but they condemned a show of mourning as proud and vain and needless, needless being a really typical Quaker word at the time. The yearly meeting in 1728 condemned, quote, wearing black or black and white clothes at burials. Funerals were kept very plain and simple. Large processions were discouraged. There were no palls, bearers, mutes, rings, or gloves. Meetings issued strict rules of restraint for these occasions. One meeting urged its members to keep out all needless and airy discourses and to behave themselves soberly and in a weighty mind as becomes truth, and not be hasty to put the corpse in the ground, but pause a little, that all may be done in a very solemn manner. The act of interment itself was also very simple among the Quakers. When Richard Cook was buried at Chester, the total expenses were 6 shillings for a plain wood coffin and 4 shillings for all other charges. John Woolman asked that his coffin be made without any ornament from ash instead of oak, because oak, quote, is a wood more useful than ash. The corpse was wrapped in a simple shroud, woven of wool in England and of linen in America. The issue of grave markers was, as Pearson Thistlethwaite has written, a special stone of stumbling for Quakers. The London Yearly Meeting recommended in 1766 that all markers should be removed from Quaker graves. Many meetings refused to agree, and Quakers quarrelled about this practice for years. Not until 1850 were gravestones approved by the London Yearly Meeting, a plain flat marker without ornament or elaborate inscriptions. Wakes were also discouraged. George Fox called them heathen custom. In the year 1700, the York Quarterly Meeting agreed that this meeting, quote, having been under their weighty considerations, the practice that is used in many places among friends at burials of giving cakes with a capital C, and providing much meat and drink for the neighbours and friends which may come to such burials. It is the sense of this meeting that the providing of too much meat would have meant food at the time in general, if I'm not mistaken, the providing too much meat and drink and cakes or such things in the method and manner aforesaid tends to the prejudice and hurt of truth's testimony. Shortly thereafter, cakes and such like things were forbidden outright by the York meeting, and 2 weighty and faithful friends were appointed to inspect and see into the practice. But they continued to occur despite official disapproval. Wakes were also discouraged in America, but never entirely suppressed. According to tradition, Quakers throughout the Delaware Valley worked out a compromise. Cakes and wine were served before a burial, and after a full meal thereafter, but with a spirit of self-restraint. The bottle was allowed to circulate only twice. As time passed, mourning customs grew more elaborate among the Quaker colonies. Thomas Chalkley complained as early as 1714 that, quote, funerals began to be growing thing among us. As late as 1782, a child's elaborate burial in a Quaker graveyard inspired one disapproving friend to write, quote, the child's father had been disowned for paying a military fine. His mother, a worthy public friend, was not present. His wife and children were members. The corpse was carried by 4 young women. 3 of them did not belong to friends, the other a disowned widow's daughter. They were dressed in white, their hands with white powder, or white with powder, without bonnets, etc. To see this show enter our graveyard and the corpse, a member of a society that professed so much plainness and self-denial, affected me much, and occasioned disagreeable observations. As this comment suggests, old attitudes towards death lingered for a century in the Delaware Valley. Among the other ethnic groups in this region, similar death customs were also kept by German pietists. So this would be, I guess, the Mennonites and the Amish. The Amish, or Amish, for example, tended to share the same optimistic fatalism, the same death watches until the flying of the spirit, the same austere burials, and the same emotional restraint. There were differences of detail. The Amish carefully washed their corpse, or the corpse, and always dressed it in white. But with these exceptions, German pietists, English Quakers, and other Protestant spiritists were very similar in their mortuary customs. In general, the deathways of these English and German cultures in the Delaware Valley had a very special texture that rose from their religious beliefs.